Hello, thank you for coming today. I will be presenting a secure coding strategy designed to reduce high-risk vulnerabilities and strengthen the organization's overall security framework. This strategy focuses on preventing common threats such as SQL injection, cross-site scripting, credential compromise, and unauthorized access. The goal is to implement layered security controls that reduce both the likelihood and impact of a breach. This security policy was created after vulnerabilities were identified in the Green PACE application through external tools and unit testing that we found weaknesses in areas like input validation and authentication. That made it clear that secure coding practices were not being consistently enforced. Another big concern is how automated cyber attacks work today. Attackers don't manually guess at vulnerabilities anymore. They use tools that scan applications quickly and repeatedly, so even a small weakness can be found and exploited very fast. Because of that, security can't be something we fix later. It has to be built into the development process from the start. That's why this policy focuses on a defense in depth approach. Instead of relying on just one layer of protection, we're implementing multiple safeguards like encryption requirements, stronger authentication controls, logging, and standardized coding practices. The goal is to move from reacting to problems after they happen to preventing them in the first place. This threat matrix organizes security risk into four categories: likely threats, high priority threats, lower priority concerns, and unlikely threats. The likely quadrant includes vulnerabilities that attackers commonly exploit, such as SQL injection, weak authentication, input validation failures, and cross-site scripting. These are all frequently targeted because automated scanning tools can detect them quickly. From an attacker's perspective, these are low-effort opportunities. The priority quadrant includes threats that would cause serious business impact if exploited. Sensitive data exposure, missing encryption, privilege escalation, and broken access control fall into this category because they directly affect customer trust, financial stability, and regulatory compliance. Some threats could conceptually belong in both categories. For example, SQL injection is both common and potentially high impact. However, this template separates frequency from business impact so that mitigation decisions are more strategic. The low priority category includes issues like insufficient logging or error messages. While they don't immediately expose sensitive data, they weaken overall security posture. Finally, the unlikely quadrant includes threats that require advanced effort or specific conditions, such as physical server access or nation state level attacks. These are possible, but less immediate concerns compared to application level vulnerabilities. By organizing risk this way, mitigation efforts focus first on vulnerabilities that are either highly exploitable or highly damaging. This slide outlines the secure coding principles that guide this policy, and they're listed in priority order based on the threat matrix. First, we have input validation, and it's prioritized because injection vulnerabilities are both common and high impact. This is enforced through strict input sanitation and the use of parameterized queries. Second, least privilege ensures users only have access to what they absolutely need. This is applied through role-based access control to reduce the risk of privilege escalation. Third, defense in depth means we don't rely on a single security control. Instead, layered authentication, encryption, and logging mechanisms work together to reduce overall risk. Next, fail securely ensures that when errors occur, the system defaults to denying access rather than granting unintended permissions. Closely related to that, secure defaults means protections like multi-factor authentication are enabled automatically rather than left optional. Encryption enforcement protects data both in transit and at rest using TLS and strong encryption standards like AES 256. Secure session management reduces session hijacking risk through proper timeout controls and token validation. Logging and monitoring provide audit trails that help detect suspicious activity and support incident response. Strong authentication ensures passwords are securely hashed and credentials are handled according to best practices. And finally, proper error handling prevents sensitive system information from being exposed through detailed system messages. By applying all these principles intentionally and in priority order, the policy ensures that the most critical risks are addressed first while still strengthening the overall security posture of the application. This slide lists the enforceable coding standards derived from the secure coding principles. They are ordered based on the risk priority identified in the threat matrix. Input validation and parameterized queries come first because injection attacks are common and highly damaging. Addressing these standards directly mitigates SQL injection and cross-site scripting risks. Role-based access control and multi-factor authentication follow, since authentication weaknesses were identified as likely and high-impact threats. Encryption requirements come next to protect sensitive data both in transit and in rest. Those controls significantly reduce the severity and potential of data exposure. Secure session management and logging help prevent session hijacking and improve visibility into suspicious activity. Password hashing and generic error handling further strengthen overall security posture by protecting credentials and limiting unnecessary system exposure. Compliance with these standards will be verified through automated static code analysis, unit testing, and peer code reviews. By embedding verification into the development workflow, enforcement becomes continuous rather than reactive. By prioritizing and verifying these standards, the policy ensures that the most critical vulnerabilities are addressed first while maintaining a structured defense-in-depth strategy. This slide outlines the encryption strategy for protecting sensitive data across 3 states: in transit, at rest, and in use. For data in transit, TLS 1.2 or higher is required, and HTTPS is enforced for all communications. This ensures that data moving between clients, servers, and APIs cannot be intercepted or altered during transmission. For data at rest, AES 256 encryption is used to protect stored information, including databases and backups. Even if the unauthorized access occurs, encryption significantly limits the usability of the exposed data and reduces the overall impact of the breach. Data in use refers to information actively being processed. While encryption cannot always be applied during processing, access is restricted through role-based access control and least privilege principles. In addition, unnecessary data exposure in memory is exposed to further reduce risk. Encryption alone does not eliminate threats, but it plays a critical role in defense in depth by protecting sensitive data throughout its entire life cycle. This slide outlines the AAA framework, which stands for authentication, authorization, and accounting. These 3 components work together to control and monitor system access. Authentication verifies a user's identity. In this policy, authentication is strengthened through multi-factor authentication and secure password hashing using bcrypt. These controls significantly reduce the risk of credential compromise and unauthorized access. Authorization determines what an authenticated user is allowed to do. This is enforced through role-based access control and least privilege principles, ensuring users only access the resources necessary for their role. Accounting focuses on tracking and monitoring system activity. Centralized logging and audit trails allow the organization to detect suspicious behavior, monitor access attempts, and support incident responses if a breach occurs. Together, these three elements create a structured access control system that supports defense in depth and reduces both external and insider threats. This section shows how external testing methods can be used to identify coding vulnerabilities before they become real security issues. I chose input validation as the focus because it directly addresses risks like SQL injection and cross-site scripting that were identified earlier in the threat matrix. Using a unit test framework like Google Test and C++, I created both positive and negative test cases to make sure valid input is accepted and unsafe input is properly rejected. The goal is to catch weaknesses early in the development rather than discovering them after the application is already deployed. On this slide, I'm showing how input validation is actually implemented in code. Instead of just talking about the principle, this is what it looks like in practice. The function checks a username to make sure it isn't empty and only contains alphanumeric characters. If it detects special characters or anything suspicious, it returns false and rejects the input. I chose input validation because it directly addresses injection risks identified in the threat matrix, like SQL injection and cross-site scripting. On the next few slides, I'll show how this function is tested using a unit test framework to confirm that it behaves securely with both normal input and malicious input attempts. I'm also using Google Tests because secure coding isn't just about writing defensive code. It's about verifying that those controls actually do work. A testing framework allows us to consistently validate expected behavior and catch vulnerabilities early in development. Google Test lets us define structured test cases and automatically compare the function's output to what we expect. In this example, one test checks that valid input returns true, and another confirms that a SQL injection attempt returns false. The main benefit of adding Google Test is automation. Instead of manually checking behavior, the framework clearly reports pass or fail results. This makes security testing repeatable, measurable, and integrated directly into the development life cycle. This first test checks whether the function accepts valid input. Here, I'm using the username Jessica123, which only contains letters and numbers, so it does meet the validation requirements. The expectation is that the function returns true since there's nothing unsafe about this input. This test matters because security controls shouldn't interfere with normal user behavior. If input validation is too strict, it can create usability problems or break legitimate functionality. Since the test passed, it confirms that the function allows safe input while still enforcing validation rules. Test 2 checks whether the function correctly rejects a common SQL injection attempt. The input string includes a typical injection pattern that tries to manipulate a database query by forcing a true condition. If input like this isn't validated properly, it could potentially allow someone to bypass authentication or gain unauthorized access to data. The expectation here is that the function returns false and rejects the input. Since the test passed, it confirms that the validation logic blocks this injection attempt before it ever reaches the database layer. This directly supports the high priority risk identified earlier in the threat matrix. Test 3 checks whether the function blocks a script injection attempt, which is commonly associated with cross-site scripting or commonly referred to as XSS. The input includes embedded script tags that could execute malicious JavaScript in a user's browser if it isn't properly validated. If something like this were accepted, it could compromise user sessions, expose sensitive information, or redirect users to malicious content. The expectation here is that the function returns false and rejects the input. Since the test passed, it confirms that the validation logic prevents script-based attacks before they ever reach the application interface. This further reinforces the injection protections identified earlier in the threat matrix. And the final test checks how the function handles empty input. An empty string might seem harmless, but accepting blank input can cause unintended behavior, especially in authentication or account-related logic. The expectation here is that the function returns false and rejects the empty value. Since the test passed, it confirms that the function follows a secure default by denying invalid or incomplete input. Testing edge cases like this is important because many vulnerabilities happen at boundary conditions, not just obvious attack attempts. On this slide, it shows how security testing fits into the full development lifecycle. Input validation and unit testing aren't meant to be one-time activities. They're integrated into the DevSecOps model, where security is embedded into every phase, from design and build to deployment and monitoring. During pre-production, secure design practices and static code analysis help catch vulnerabilities early. Unit tests, like the Google test examples I showed, run during the build phase to automatically verify that security controls behave as expected. Once the application moves into production, monitoring, logging, and incident response process continues that protection. Security doesn't stop at deployment, it becomes part of ongoing operations. By automating testing and integrating it into each stage, vulnerabilities are identified early, consistently, and before they become a costly security incident. On this slide, I'm explaining how the tools support the DevSecOps pipeline shown earlier. In the design and build stages, static code analysis tools scan the code to catch potential vulnerabilities before compilation. During the build phase, Google Test runs automated unit tests to make sure security controls like input validation are actually working as expected. Before code is merged, peer code reviews provide human oversight to catch logic issues or security gaps that automation might miss. During deployment, CI and CD pipelines enforce security gates, meaning the application cannot move forward if tests fail. And once a system is in production, logging and monitoring tools continuously track activity to detect suspicious behavior. By integrating these tools across the entire life cycle, security becomes continuous instead of something that only happens after a problem occurs. On this slide, I'm evaluating both the risks and the benefits of the proposed security strategy. The main problems identified include injection, vulnerabilities like SQL and XSS, credential compromise risk, and gaps in validation and monitoring. Acting now significantly reduces the likelihood of a breach. Strong input validation, encryption, and authentication controls lower both financial risk and reputational damage. Early implementation also supports regulatory compliance and improves long-term system stability. That being said, there are trade-offs. Implementing these controls can increase development time and introduce some performance overhead. Security tools also require ongoing maintenance and monitoring to remain effective. If implementation is delayed, the organization remains exposed to high-impact vulnerabilities that could lead to data breaches or operational disruptions. Moving forward, the recommended next steps include expanding automated test coverage, conducting regular security audits, and providing secure coding training for the development teams. Overall, the benefits of implementing this strategy outweigh the risks, especially when compared to the cost of a potential security incident. This slide highlights the remaining gaps in the current security strategy. While input validation, encryption, and authentication controls have been implemented, automated testing is still limited to specific components. Expanding test coverage across all input fields and APIs would significantly strengthen the overall security posture. Another gap is the lack of formal secure coding training requirement. So technical controls are critical, but long-term security also depends on developer awareness and consistent practices. Monitoring and logging policies also need clearer definition. That includes setting alert thresholds and documenting how incidents are handled. Establishing a formal incident response playbook would ensure faster containment and recovery if a breach does occur. Addressing these areas would shift the strategy from being mostly reactive to fully proactive and organization-wide. In conclusion, preventing future security issues requires adopting clear, enforceable standards across the organization. Secure coding practices should align with established frameworks such as OWASP, input validation, and parameterized queries need to be mandatory across all applications to reduce injection risks. Authentication controls should include multi-factor authentication and strong password hashing, and encryption should be enforced by default for both data in transit and data at rest. Secure testing should be integrated into CI/CD pipelines to ensure continuous verification and monitoring. And incident response procedures should be clearly defined and consistently applied. By standardizing these controls and embedding them into the development lifecycle, the organization can proactively reduce risk, strengthen resilience, and prevent future vulnerabilities. To summarize, this security strategy focuses on preventing vulnerabilities before they become incidents. By implementing strong input validation, secure authentication, encryption by default, and automated testing within a DevSecOps pipeline, we significantly reduce both the likelihood and impact of a breach. Security is not a one-time task. It requires consistent standards, automation, monitoring, and ongoing developer awareness. By formalizing these controls and embedding them into the development lifecycle, the organization can move from reactive security to proactive, resilient posture that protects both its systems and its reputation. Thank you.